These are true tales of terror and the paranormal. From the staff at connectingvets.com, this is our Vet Ghost Story. We begin with a tale from Connecting Vets reporter, Julia LEDOUX.
Now, this all happened when I was about 7, going on 8 years old. My family and I had just moved from California back to Camp Lejeune. This was especially important to me, guys, because I had my own room and didn't have to share one with my baby sister, so that's cool. So when we moved into the house, weird things, little things started happening, like papers would be moved around. You'd put something like on the counter and it wouldn't be there. All very, very, very strange. But what really scared us and the whole family was what happened one day. After I came home from school, my mom worked. And like I said, I was about 8. And after she got off work, she would go pick up my sister and they would be home within like 10 or 15 minutes to me getting off the bus. So being the big 8-year-old that I was able to unlock the door with my very own key, go inside and sit in the living room and wait for my mom to come. Don't go into the kitchen and turn on the stove, any of that kind of stuff. So one day I opened up the door, walked into our house, and no kidding, there was a knife from the kitchen floating in the air in the middle of our bedroom. I screamed and ran out of the house as fast as I could. Well, now, our neighbors across the street, she was a very sweet lady. She would always kind of watch out for me until Mom got home. Well, she heard me scream. She came running out. What's going on? I'm like, there was a knife floating in there. She's like, yeah, really. About that time, my mom came home, got out of the car. She's like, what's going on? I told her, Mom, there was a knife floating in the air. Mom kind of sort of didn't believe me because she thought, uh-oh, you went into that kitchen and you messed with that knife and you're trying to cover your butt, right? But no, I hadn't. Everybody walked in, the knife was in the middle of the living room floor. I was swearing up and down, no, I didn't touch this knife. I didn't touch this knife. That incident was the scariest thing that happened in the house. Now, after that, other little things happened. One day we came home and the water was running in the bathtub. It was strange, just strange stuff. Fast forward again, a couple of years later, my parents had sold that house, moved a little closer to Jacksonville. And my mom was working at the Marine Corps Exchange. She was working in what the Bad Check Redemption Center is? So that's where people had to go and get the checks that they had written bad. So this guy came up to get his check back, and Mom got it, and she looked at it and she said, oh, we lived at this house. It was our address that he had on the house. And he kind of stepped back from Mom and said, ma'am, did you ever have anything strange happen in the house? And so Mom said, yeah. And she recounted the knife in the air incident, the bathtub water running, things being moved around. And he nodded his head and he said, well, have you heard that the subdivision, which was a new subdivision, he said, we just found out that it was built on an old Indian burial ground. And maybe they didn't move the bodies that had been buried there.
Our next tale comes to us from Connecting Vets reporter, Jack Murphy.
So yeah, when I was in the Army, I was stationed at Fort Benning for a while, and right outside Fort Benning is the town of Columbus, Georgia. And as a young soldier, it gets pretty boring. There's not a whole lot out to do there other than drinking, which soldiers are pretty notorious for. We get into a lot of trouble, and after we got into a lot of trouble, you start to think, what else can we do? You start looking around, and I don't know exactly how me and some of the guys in my squad got into this, but what we started doing was ghost hunting around Columbus, Georgia and Fort Benning. So there's some abandoned graveyards way out in Fort Benning that are just completely isolated that we go and check out. It's interesting, I guess. But then one day we got this idea in our heads that we should go check out an abandoned hospital in Columbus. It's kind of on the road heading towards Phoenix City. And it's a big complex, like a really big abandoned hospital. And we went over there one night. We parked my car, went over, walked around the building until we found a way in. I believe we crawled through a broken window still, actually. Got inside this building. And like I said, it is huge and sprawling and dark inside this place. Broken glass on the floor, just crap laying all over the place. We even found satanic graffiti on the walls where like the local Wiccan chapter, who I don't know who the hell it was, somebody was in there messing around, went through like surgical wards and things like this. And eventually we got down to the basement. And down in the basement, we found the morgue. And they had their like refrigerated, gurneys for the bodies. And of course, there's no bodies or anything like that. Everything's sanitized in this hospital, but it's all down there still, the refrigeration gurneys and all of that. And, being good Ranger Battalion soldiers, we took turns laying in the gurney, with like our arms crossed in front of us and having our friends take pictures and stuff. And so while we're down there kind of goofing off, one of the guys in my squad, Jeremy, is standing by the doorway. He's like standing kind of in the doorway looking out into the hall down the basement. And down the hall, it kind of turned into like a T-junction, maybe like 25 feet down the hall. And so Jeremy is just standing there while we're goofing off. And all of a sudden, Jeremy backpedals like really hard and slams into the door behind him. And he kind of like looks up at me and says, well, we should follow that guy. And I'm like, Jeremy, what guy? What the hell are you talking about? And he's like, I saw a guy. And I was like, okay, man. And we went out there and we walked down the hall and there's no one there. And we walked around the hall some more. We walked around the hall in some of the adjacent rooms looking around. There's absolutely nobody down there. I mean, we're down in a basement in an abandoned hospital in the middle of the night. There's just no one there. And Jeremy was like, he could recall some details about the guy, that he had like longish hair that came down over the back of his head, and he was wearing like a white lab coat, like a doctor. And Jeremy, to this day, I mean, he'll tell you he saw a ghost. And I mean, I don't know what he saw, but I can tell you for sure he was spooked. He was scared by whatever he saw that night. Never totally got over it. So yeah, it's a little creepy. I mean, if anything, I kind of wish I had seen it and I had that experience, and then maybe I could, I don't know, maybe it would help me understand it. I don't know.
Our next tale comes to us from Connecting Vets reporter Abby Bennett.
I have lots and lots of friends who have told the same ghost story about Fort Bragg a couple of different times. So there are a couple of neighborhoods in Fayetteville that abut different parts of Fort Bragg and the artillery ranges out there. And so they back up to the woods, and anytime there are artillery trainings going on, our houses shake, things fall off the walls. Anybody who lives in Fayetteville is very used to that. But if you are a teenager of ill repute and you spend any time in those woods, despite the many, many warning signs and fences, there are lots of kids who tell stories about seeing other people walking through the woods in what look like Civil War uniforms. Very, very clear sightings of people wearing blue or gray uniforms. And obviously, nobody in our service currently should be wearing blue or gray uniforms like this. And this includes people carrying what look like, muskets or or old time rifles and things like that. And not just seeing people, but also hearing things, hearing shouts, hearing the pop of guns. I have one friend who swears they heard horse hooves in those woods before. And I lived in Fort Bragg and Fayetteville for a very long time. I never saw horses in our neighborhoods. It was not that kind of neighborhood, I assure you. But I have so many friends who swear that they have seen or heard things in those woods that feel like they don't belong. And what's interesting is that those woods and that area of Fort Bragg is a place we later found out where there was a Civil War battle. It's the Battle of Monroe Crossing. It happened in 1865. And I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, some Confederate soldiers ambushed some Union soldiers. So the Confederate soldiers were cavalry, and so were the Union soldiers, but the Union soldiers were caught off guard. So they were not on horseback, and they were ambushed by the Confederates. And the fighting went on for a couple of hours from what we were able to sort of research. But there definitely was a battle called Monroe Crossing in those woods. And so that has made a lot of the people that I know who say they've seen these things feel for sure that that's what they saw, that what they were seeing were apparitions of, soldiers who died during that particular battle. These are really detailed accounts that I feel like would be really hard to sort of just make up out of nowhere and for no reason other than, to have fun with people. But at the same time, I have to disclose that these trips to the woods often involved mind-altering substances that may have influenced how people perceived the world, and whether that brought them closer to the other side or helped them make up really interesting stories, I'm not going to pass judgment on.
Our final vet ghost story comes from yours truly. Now, this story happened to me long before I would join the Army, but nevertheless, here it is. I was 8 years old, and my family lived in the sleepy little Air Force town of Alamogordo, New Mexico. Shout out to Davis Monthan. It was sometime in the mid-'80s, I think, at the height of the Satanic Panic. Now, I'm not sure if you all remember what that is, but there was this whole thing about Satan worshipers stealing kids and human sacrifices. Of course, this was all around the Halloween timeframe. That Satanic Panic hit Alamogordo hard. It was and still is a very small town, so word and panic traveled super fast. Now, at the time, my family belonged to what they called a church, and now with some reflection, I might call it a cult. It was super Pentecostal, and by super, I mean they were hardcore in their beliefs and practices. Now, what made it kind of culty was that our church was out in the middle of the desert, members only, and the whole thing just had a weird vibe to it. Kind of hard to explain, but if you were a kid growing up in a fundamentalist household in the 80s, you get it. So everyone's already blaming the devil for everything. Kids are loving it because they can spray a pentagram on something and everyone goes nuts. It's in the newspaper, and it's just insanity. It was a small town on the edge. So one day we're in church. Everyone's saying songs. We did our morning Bible kids class, which, by the way, reinforced the notion that He-Man and the toys associated with him were all tools of the devil. We're all in the main church room when the doors to the room burst open, and this guy comes in wearing a brown suit and yelling at everyone. Now, I notice he's holding on to something red in his right hand, and it turns out it's a gasoline container. Now, everyone starts to freak out. This guy walks right up to the front of the church where the preacher is standing and starts to douse the area with gas. And he's ranting and raving, screaming and hollering, just being a generally crazy person. Once the gas hits the ground, though, people start to panic and they go running out the back. Now, I'm 8 and stupid. I want to see what's going to happen. So I duck down and I go low crawling under the pews to get a better look. I think the real miracle here is that I wasn't trampled to death, but somehow I made it close to the action. Now, there's a group of men from the church surrounding this guy. They all start praying together with the preacher, and the guy in the brown suit and the gasoline starts freaking out even more. Now he's screaming and growling at the men around him. He starts to lunge at them, but he can't seem to put his hands on them. His face begins to contort, and just like in the movies, different voices start coming out of the guy's throat. Suddenly, I feel something grab me by my feet and drag me away fast and hard. I try to kick because I'm pretty sure it's a demon dragging me to hell. It's my mom, and from the look on her face, I would have been better off with the demon in hell. So she picks me up and throws me over her shoulder and runs out of there. The last thing I see is my dad praying with the other men around this guy. Hours pass, and finally my dad comes home. He looks exhausted. My mom and dad do that frantic whisper conversation, that thing where you can't quite understand what they're saying, but you know it's important. The next day, I approach my parents about what happened. My dad tells me that the guy was possessed. The minister exorcised the man, and when the demon left, the man had no recollection of what had just happened or why he was there. The other thing that was weird was that the gasoline fumes disappeared. The carpet was still wet, but it looked and smelled like nothing, like it was just water. We would return to church a few days later, and it was definitely the talk of the church for weeks to come, but we would end up moving away from Alamogordo about a year later. I would hear about police busting up a satanic ritual with a cauldron full of kidnapped children. None of that was true, of course, and if it was, it didn't make the papers. We moved out of there in 1989, and I've only gone back driving through there en route to Texas from Arizona. Was that guy possessed? Dunno. But what I do know is that I witnessed part of an exorcism when I was 8, and that hasn't left me. I don't know what really happened in that church. Don't really care, to be honest with you. And my dad? Well, he's never spoken about that to this day. All right, folks, that was my ghost story. You can find out real stories, real veteran stories, news that matters to you by visiting us at connectingvets.com. Be sure to check out our other podcast, The Back Brief. We talk about some of the news that really matters, and we don't want you to miss out on it. Stay informed, stay powerful. Knowledge is power. And folks, it is that time of the year. Go vote. We don't care who you vote for, just go vote. Do your civic duty. Make sure you check out the other vet stories here. I'm Rod Rodriguez, and I'll see you at the next vet story.